I'm Ken Rockwell. Let's look at Nikon's 105mm f2.8 lens for their Z series of cameras. Let's first, however, take a look just how sharp this lens is with some pictures I can take with it. Lenses are at their softest in the far corners at their maximum aperture, which in this case is f2.8. Now, this is a shot of my bicycle, and I'm zooming in using my video editing software. I'm not moving the camera or anything. This is wide open at f2.8, which you would not do in daylight. And at a 1600th of a second at ISO 64, this is a shot straight out of the camera, and I'm zooming in, and you can read the lettering off my tires, which is barely visible even to the naked eye. That is pretty good. Again, another shot in broad daylight, which no reasonable person would shoot at f2.8 if he really wanted a sharp shot, because the depth of field is so narrow, especially at macro distances. Here it is wide open at f2.8 in broad daylight at a 2000th of a second at ISO 64. The trees are in focus, but nothing else is. The mountains in the background won't be in focus. So we know this is a sharp lens. In fact, all of Nikon's lenses are sharp. All of Nikon's macro lenses are sharp, so that's no mystery. 100mm, 105mm is pretty much a normal size for a macro lens. This is a great lens for use as a general-purpose telephoto, portrait lens, as well as a macro lens. Ideally, for serious macro use, I like to use a longer lens just so I can stand even further away from my subject and get an even better perspective rendering, because it looks more natural when you're a couple of feet away as opposed to half a foot away. This is their first 105mm lens for the Z-mount. It's also their first 105mm lens with an organic light-emitting diode, or OLED screen. Now, it's a bit of a joke because it only works when you push this display button. But what happens is, if you do push the display button, it's just like digital watches from the 1970s where you used to have to push a button. People got tired of that real quick. You have about several different displays here. This is the reproduction ratio scale. This is actually kind of nice. As macro lenses go, this is kind of the best reproduction ratio scale I've seen. Well, it'd be nice to have an option with a pure digital readout as opposed to the scale readout. But that is a nice feature. You also can get the f-stop, which by default is also controlled by this ring on the lens. Here's the problem, though. This moves too fast, and there are no clicks. So although this looks cool in a video, it actually works really crummy in practice, because if I just want to go to M1 f-stop, it's like I'm twiddling all around here. This lens also has what's known as a compensating diaphragm system. It always reads the real effective f-stop as you focus more closely. So what happens is when you're focused at infinity, you can get to f2.8. As you focus more closely, the actual available maximum aperture becomes smaller. You'll notice you can't see that I'm focusing closely because there's only one display at once. But as you get to 1:1, the largest aperture you can get is f4.5. At infinity, you can only get to f32. However, as you focus more closely, you can get to smaller apertures, and at 1:1, you can get to f51. You can also read out just straight focus distance. You'll notice that line underneath there, that's showing your depth of field. Now, that's kind of a cool feature, although to be honest, this is not a rangefinder camera. You can just look through the viewfinder and see exactly what's in focus or not. But as we change our aperture here, which again, you can't see, you can see if you look there, see, changing my aperture, you'll see that the depth of field changes. That's kind of cool. And then press it again, and we're back to a reproduction ratio scale. If you hold this in for a few seconds, you get to the settings where you can control its brightness. Tap it again, you control meters or feet, and those are your settings. Real exciting. This looks cool on a video, but in actual practice, do I want to have to press this button? No, I just want it on all the time. I find it more of a feature than anything that you really need. There's a programmable lens function button, which by default is focus lock. In your camera, you can set that however you like. It is nice that it has reasonably good set of controls here. Auto and manual switch. I found this mandatory for all of my autofocus lenses, and it's sad that too many cameras today pass on that. You also have a focus limiter. You can go between 1.5 feet and 1 foot. The reason for this is this position doesn't let the lens focus any further away than about 1.5 feet. And the reason for that is, for some reason, if you're shooting macro and the lens keeps trying to focus on something in the background, put it here, it won't focus too far away. I've never used that position. The bad news is it's offshore to Thailand. It's not made in Japan. The outside's all plastic. Most of the inside's plastic. There is some metal on the inside, and this rear trim ring is metal, and the mount is metal, but that's about it. All this other stuff is plastic. Do I feel good paying close to $1,000 for a lens that is offshored and mostly plastic? Absolutely not. Another choice is the 105mm VR AFS lens, which you can use on the FTZ adapter. That works just as well, and also would work on your F cameras. Some good things about this lens. The optics are superb, as we expect. Nikon is making macro lenses since 1956. It's one of their specialties. They make microscopes. They've been doing microscopes for longer. They've been doing cameras. They're expert at that. They really know their stuff when it comes to close-up. It's nice that you do have full-time manual focus override anytime you grab this ring. That's one of the advantages of the Nikon system over Canon or Sony, and especially Fuji, is that the other brands, there's too many things to twiddle around. With Canon, you can get a pretty good approximation, but you have to go into some menus to get it. With this, anytime that the camera is actually awake, you turn this, it's going to focus. In fact, it's so good that even if you're in continuous autofocus mode, once you grab this ring to tell it what you want it to do, it's smart enough to just hold the distance that you set. I love that. The bad news is this is not a real manual focus ring. It's just an electronic manual focus ring. The reason that's bad is turning this does not move the lens. Turning this sends a signal to the computer in the camera, which thinks about it and then sends a signal to the motors in the lens to focus the lens. The problem is there's always a slight fraction of a second delay. It doesn't seem like anything if you just play with this, say at your friend's house, you turn this, the focus changes, but when you're actually zoomed in on a tripod and trying to set the exact focus for something, you'll discover the fact that there's always a slight delay means you can't just do this and lock it in. You do this, have to wait, do that, wait. And it's a tiny fraction of a second, but it means you actually have to stop and see what's going on to get that precise focus. And when you're gliding into a focus, you can't just sort of estimate the way you've always done with real mechanically focused lenses. You just have that second sense of how far you're going to have to turn it because it's delayed. So in other words, if you're just doing this and just stop when you hit home plate, no, then the lens is going to overshoot a little bit. So that's a real problem. And if you really do macro a lot, I don't recommend this lens. I would recommend the VRAFS lens, which does have a direct mechanically coupled manual focus ring. It'll give you better, faster manual focus. Or ideally, if you're serious about macro, you really want to go 200 millimeters because you can stand further away from your subject, not block your light, not annoy living subjects, and get a better rendition. In fact, if you're a cheapskate, for about $550 US as of the writing of this video in August of 2021, you can get this Irix lens, which is a Korean-made lens designed in Switzerland. It's manual focus only. It has full data communications. Use this with the FTZ. It's got 150 millimeter focal length. It's got great optics. It has direct mechanical focus. I would rather use this Irix lens if I was shooting in a studio all day long macro, which I do. In my studio, I'm usually using a macro lens. It's usually my 200 millimeter Nikon lens on a DSLR. Direct mechanical focus, I get much more done faster, and I get the correct perspective rendition. What's missing is there's no VR switch on the outside of the lens. There should be. Nikon's better lenses in the past have included that. That means I don't have to go into the menus to turn VR on or off, depending on what I'm doing. Nikon, they just got cheap on that. Autofocus speed is moderately slow. It's precise, but it's far from instantaneous. It's optimized for getting exactly right focus. It's not great if you're trying to track moving action. What is good is it never gets stuck. Older cameras with macro lenses, especially in autofocus, oftentimes would just get lost if you were way out of focus, i.e. if the subject was 2 feet away and the lens is focused at infinity, it might just be so far out of focus that the autofocus system would just give up and not focus or get stuck at one end or the other. At least on the Z cameras, this lens doesn't get stuck. It directly just hums along, not very quickly, but when it gets focus, it focuses. Autofocus is not silent, nor is manual focus. It turns out there's a stepper motor. There's no longer a silent AFS, silent wave motor. It's a stepper motor, which hums as it works. Does that matter? Not to me, it doesn't. Focus breathing, the image from this lens gets slightly larger as focused more closely. Let's look at bokeh. Bokeh is the feel or character or quality of the out of focus areas. It's not simply how far out of focus they are. It's neutral at large apertures and becomes poor at small apertures. In other words, large apertures, the blur circles, are just circles. But as I stop down, and again, each of these images I'm zooming in my video editing software, I'm not actually zooming the camera, you'll notice that the edges of the circles are a little bit brighter than the centers. That's the worst thing because it's accentuating the edges of the circles. Ideally, you want Gaussian blobs that don't even have any definition for the out of focus areas. Distortion is non-existent on a Z camera, which corrects for it automatically. If you turn off the distortion, then go looking for it, it actually does with a small amount of barrel distortion, which isn't visible, but Photoshop's lens correction filter would take a factor of about plus 1.0 to correct for it. Ergonomically, this slim rubber ring at the front is just a slim rubber ring at the front. It's not connected to anything except the barrel of the lens. It would seem silly, but it's actually really handy because when I'm shooting, I grab on this And this way I don't accidentally knock the focus ring. So this is a great way to hold the lens while shooting. It's also really handy. I remember Nikon's AI lenses. Here's Nikon's manual focus 2.8. Would always have these brilliant metal rings so you could always see them or feel them with the lights off, and use that to mount your lens on your camera. Shades of that, bam. This here is great. Just grab that ring and you're good, as opposed to grabbing for whatever else moves or rotates. Actually, I like that. That's a feature that I didn't expect that I would like as much as I do. Fall off is not a problem. Even wide open, the camera corrects for it. And even if you turn off the correction, it's not that bad. Full aperture and stop down a little bit and it goes away. There's no need for thin filters. I can use quite a stack of 62mm filters here with no vignetting. So go whole hog. You don't need to buy thin filters. There's no real problem with flare or ghosts. I'll show that later. Never saw any lateral color. Macro performance, well, of course, it works great. Remember, the effective aperture is f4.5 as you focus closely. Please don't go returning this lens because you think it's defective, because it doesn't give you 2.8 when focused to 1:1. It's only going to give you f4.5 because of the way the optics work. That's normal. Here it is wide open at f4.5. The depth of field is so tiny this close that even different parts of the watch face, you'll notice it's sort of a three-dimensional face. Some of the dials are inset, a couple of microns more than other parts. So it's not all in focus, but it is ultra, ultra sharp. The serial number is laser engraved on the bottom of the barrel. I don't see much in the way of spherochromatism. That's great. If we look at Sunstars, again, the vertical smear is interline transfer smear from the camera sensor. Don't worry about that. And if we get to really small apertures, the little rainbow things you see are more craziness inside the camera than an artifact of the lens. I get some okay 18-pointed Sunstars, but only at the smallest apertures. I also have an extensive comparison section on my online review where you can see this compared to every Nikon macro lens they've made since about 1970, along with pictures of each of the lenses. Optically, they're all equally good. In fact, I should cover that. Some people worry about, is one macro lens sharper than the other macro lens? And no, that's not an issue. And there's like 3 reasons for that. Number 1, the sharpest lens any camera maker can make is a medium short telephoto lens, anywhere between about 50 and 105 millimeters, because those are the easiest to design. A 100 millimeter lens is long enough that the corner effects aren't a problem. In other words, the picture angles are narrow enough that it's really easy to design a lens because you don't have to deal with all the problems you do in the corners of an ultra-wide lens. So that becomes simple. And it's also short enough that the chromatic problems you get, secondary color and so forth, are not a problem with something as simple as a 105 millimeter lens. So there's 2 reasons there that a 100 millimeter lens is easy to make ultra sharp. When you have only an f2.8 lens versus an f2 or an f1.4, again, with a moderate aperture, optical students can design this in their first year to be incredibly high resolution. And that's only if you use maybe 3 or 4 elements to make a 105 millimeter f2.8 lens. Something like this, which has maybe 4 times as many elements as that, it is so incredibly complex, it is more than fully corrected for everything. Also, this lens, like all of Nikon's macro lenses since about 1982, are self-compensating, meaning that as you focus them, they have close range correction, which means the elements actually move around relative to each other to optimize the optical performance of the lens for each and every focus distance as you focus it. So when you throw all that technology on a focal length and speed of a lens, which is so easy to design in the first place, every single macro lens is going to be essentially optically flawless and probably diffraction limited by about f4 or f5.6. And that's when you're shooting wide open, they're ultra sharp. When you stop them down, all lenses become about equally sharp and limited by diffraction. But here's the other reason you won't see any optical difference between 100 millimeter macro lenses. The reason why is if you're shooting at f2.8, you're a little bit crazy because nothing will be in focus. The depth of field is so narrow, the only way you could see any difference in performance is actually at that 3 atoms depth worth of image where they'd both be in perfect focus, and you could actually see some optical degradation if there was any. As soon as you move a millimicron one way or the other, you're out of focus, and then they're equally out of focus. Or in reality, when you're shooting macro, I usually shoot at f22 to f32. That's the best you can do because you need to get things in focus. And even if you're a fraction of a millimeter out, even at f32, then you're out of focus. So your shooting stopped down. So again, diffraction limits the performance of any of these optical systems, not which lens it is. So if you're shopping for macro lenses, please, the least of your worries is if one is, quote, sharper, unquote, than the next one. The sharpness really depends on your ability to keep your subject flat and keep it parallel to the plane of the sensor so the things can stay in focus and be sharp. This is a great choice if you want a macro for Nikon Z cameras. There's a lot of other things you can do if you're a cheapskate, although to be honest, I do like this lens. The manual focus is a bit of a pain, but I think it's acceptable. And the ultralight weight of this lens, this is a very lightweight feeling lens. It almost feels a little bit like you got ripped off because it is so light, but it's a great lens. If you're shooting the Z system, by all means, get this lens. Don't get this awful little thing, the 50 millimeter, because the 50 millimeter is not that much less expensive, but it's entirely made out of plastic. It's offshore to communist China, and it just feels dinky. Also, its focus doesn't work that precisely. I am not at all happy with this lens. In fact, the 50 millimeter is the worst macro lens Nikon has ever made, ever since they started making macro lenses in 1956. So I would pass on this if macro is your thing. However, if your thing is you just want a lightweight normal lens, it's reasonably fast, it have 2.8 that you can use to shoot everything, and has the additional benefit of being able to focus super closely if you need it to, then by all means, get this 50. But if you're shooting dedicated macro, please get the 105, get the Irix 150, or man up and get the Nikon 200mm f4, which won't autofocus on a Z camera, but it's what I prefer to use because I can stand further away from my subject and have less problem with lighting, less problem with annoying the subject, and render the subject in a more natural perspective. Thanks again for watching Ken Rockwell, reading my reviews at kenrockwell.com, and watching it here on kenrockwell.tv.